Right, in this lesson we're looking at cell signaling. So in the cause, effect, detect, correct land, we're still really looking at corrections here and ways that they do that. So always through effectors. Okay, so again, that might be a gland, might be a muscle, depends. All right, so when the body goes to correct something, it needs to have, I'm going to say, a coordinated plan of attack. And cells are part of this, right? Cells, including nerve cells, obviously that makes a lot of sense to us, really have a big role to play here. But what they need to do is coordinate, okay? So they have to work together. It's not just one cell, or look, one cell in this gland is going to produce a hormone. It has to be all of them, and it has to make sure it gets to where it needs to go. When it gets there, it needs to make sure it's affecting the right cells, and the right cells are then doing their job. It's a massive chain reaction, and making sure that it works is really important. And obviously when things go wrong in that chain reaction, things go wrong and you will end up with, terrible deficiencies. You might have genes that aren't expressed and therefore proteins that aren't created. So lots going on there. So what we need in this kind of situation are signaling cells, right? So we have cells that have already signaled to different cells that, hey, there's a problem going on, and what we need to do is we need to send a message. And what they do is they send a ligand. Now, a ligand is simply a chemical messenger, right? So in our case of hormones, a hormone molecule is a ligand, right? So they are also signaling molecules. Just kind of a generic name for many different things, right? So once that ligand has been sent out, then a target cell is going to receive it. So it has receptors on it, and those receptors are usually proteins, so receptor proteins, we'll call them receptor proteins there, right? So already we're picking up a lot of different things in this process. We've got signaling cells, we've got target cells, we've got ligands, and we've got receptor proteins, okay? So there's a lot of different players in this game. Once that target cell has kind of figured out what's going on and the receptor protein has appeared, then that ligand, sorry, not receptor protein, the ligand has appeared. The ligand bonds to the receptor, and that should trigger that chain reaction we talked about. And therefore, we're going to call it signal transduction, because that's really what's going on here. The signal is being transmitted around the body. Now, it may kind of be a different one, a different chain reaction depending on what's going on there, and it's kind of a translation. So this is a translation of, say, a chemical signal into muscle movement, or that adrenaline starts to fire, goes around your bloodstream, then it's going to hit your heart and your heart's going to start beating faster. So that's translating that chemical signal into actual kinetic energy and changes there. Now, different might be the same ligand, mean different things to different receptor proteins, right? So same ligand can mean different signals, really, depending on where the depending on the target cell that the receptor has, right? So the same ligand can be different signals or different translations depending on the receptor on the target cell. And a really good example of that is it's a chemical called acetylcholine. And if acetylcholine gets to a receptor on a cardiac cell, so a cardiac muscle cell, and if it gets to a skeletal muscle cell, it does the exact opposite, right? So if it gets to cardiac muscle, it actually relaxes it. But if it gets to skeletal muscle, it actually makes it contract. All right, I've managed to bugger that up. Okay, so there's a lot of different things going on here, but it keeps coming back to this same pathway, right? Signaling cells will send that chemical messenger to a target cell with a receptor protein, and that's going to kick off a chain of events, right? Now, receptors, back here we've talked about the protein receptors. These can be extracellular, which means they can be outside, on the membrane, or they can be intracellular. So some of the molecules that are sent need to be able to get through the membrane, others might not be able to and therefore have to stay on the outside. So there's lots of different kinds of cell signaling, and here is some I prepared earlier. We have contact dependent, which literally means the two cells need to sit next to one another and hand over that chemical molecule, right? Has to hand it to the thing next to it, and it can't really go much further than that. If we move on to that bigger scale, then we talk about paracrine cell signaling. And that's kind of one cell putting out those ligands, those tiny little signaling molecules, out into the close vicinity. So some cells that are not right next to it, but a few of them that are around. If we go smaller scale here, autocrine signaling means the cell actually signals itself. It is both the signaling cell and the target cell. And that seems a bit strange, that it's putting out a molecule, but it can actually trigger itself into being part of that chain reaction. And I want you to notice the difference between autocrine and intracrine here. In this case, the receptor is extracellular, but in this case, the receptor is intracellular. So this one is making its ligand and, again, sending it to its own receptor, but its own receptor is on its nuclear membrane, not on its extracellular membrane. But they're both signaling to themselves, which seems a bit strange. All right, endocrine, they're the ones that we're a bit more used to, and they're our general hormones. And the difference between most of these and this one is this uses the bloodstream, okay? So they are sending chemical messages, and if they are able to send them via the bloodstream, they can send them much further, all right, and therefore affect a lot more different target cells. Synaptic signaling is specific only to neurons. It's specific only to the nervous system, and its target cells can once again be muscles, it can be the glands that we talked about before, our effectors, or it can actually be another neuron, right? Neurons run back to back to back, and we'll talk more about that later on down the track. And their specific chemical messengers are called neurotransmitters, and they're very, very specific to what type of neurons that are working and what we're actually trying to target there and what effector is being targeted. We need to know about these is, in the same way that enzymes work with our lock and key mechanism, these ones do as well. And that means that the chemical messenger has to be extremely specific for the receptor and vice versa. A chemical signal or a chemical messenger is not going to work unless that receptor is specific for that chemical molecule.